What happened to African gods? After the Bible appeared. Disappearance of African gods. When the Bible arrived alongside colonization, a dramatic shift began across Africa. The Orishas, ancestral spirits and countless local deities that had guided people for generations were suddenly branded as evil, superstitious, or even demonic. Missionaries preached that these gods had no place in the new truth, while colonizers used religion as a tool to break cultural identity. But here's the hidden truth. These gods never really vanished. They were not destroyed, they were silenced. Communities were forced to push their faith into the shadows, practicing in secret or disguising their rituals to survive. The disappearance of African gods was never about them fading away. Written word versus oral tradition. For thousands of years, African spirituality thrived through oral traditions. Stories, songs, rituals, and dances carried the wisdom of the ancestors. These traditions were alive. They weren't just words, they were performances, living knowledge passed down from generation to generation. In African societies, the spoken word was sacred. A song wasn't just entertainment, it was a prayer. A story wasn't just a tale, it was history, philosophy, and moral guidance woven into one. Oral tradition connected people to nature, to their ancestors, and to the divine. Then came the Bible. Unlike African spirituality, it was a written text. And this made all the difference. Colonizers and missionaries presented the Bible as the ultimate truth, the one final authority. Because it was written down, it carried a sense of permanence and power. Written words could be copied, spread, and enforced. Meanwhile, oral traditions were dismissed as unstable, untrustworthy, and even primitive. The clash was not only religious, it was cultural warfare. European missionaries declared that written narratives were official, while oral wisdom was branded as pagan, witchcraft, or superstition. Imagine centuries of living traditions suddenly being dismissed simply because they were not written in a book. This was more than just spreading Christianity. It was about rewriting what counted as truth. By elevating the written word and dismissing oral wisdom, colonizers redefined knowledge itself. Schools taught children that to be educated meant to read and write the Bible, while songs, drumming, storytelling, and ancestral rituals were called backwards, or even evil. The written word was a weapon. It gave missionaries authority, while stripping Africans of theirs. But here's the irony. The very thing that colonizers dismissed, oral tradition, is what kept African spirituality alive. Even when temples were destroyed, and even when rituals were banned, the voice of the ancestors survived through whispers, chants, and stories told around the fire. Oral traditions could not be burned because they lived inside people. So the battle between the Bible and African spirituality was never just about religion. It was about whose truth gets to survive. The Bible came as the official truth, but the oral traditions of Africa never died. They went underground, waiting for the moment when their voices would rise again. Youth power, suppression, and the rewriting of history. Colonization and Christianity. When colonizers stepped onto African soil, they carried more than weapons and flags. They carried the Bible. At first glance, it looked like a book of faith, but in reality, it became one of the strongest tools of control. Missionaries preached salvation, but behind that promise was a deeper goal: to dismantle the spiritual foundation of African societies. Conversion was not a peaceful invitation. It often meant the destruction of sacred spaces, shrines, and temples where generations had prayed. Drums were silenced, masks were burned, and rituals were banned. Every baptism was not just a new religious beginning. It was a symbolic act of cutting ties with one's ancestors. To embrace the cross often meant rejecting the very roots of identity. For many Africans, this was not just about changing gods. It was about a forced rewriting of the soul. The colonizers knew that by replacing spiritual traditions with Christianity, they could reshape how people saw themselves. If a community no longer believed in the power of their ancestors, it became easier to make them submit to foreign authority. Spiritual conquest was the first step toward political and cultural domination. This process was deeper than most realize. Imagine growing up surrounded by rituals that connected you to your grandparents, to the land, to the rivers, and to the stars above. Then suddenly, being told those practices are evil, being told your gods are demons, being told your ancestors were wrong. That kind of message doesn't just change beliefs, it creates shame. It teaches you to fear your own roots. This is why historians call it a colonization of the soul. The body could be enslaved, but when the spirit was conquered too, resistance became even harder. Religion was used not only to control how people prayed, but also to control how they thought, how they lived, and how they defined themselves. Yet despite this violence, many resisted. Some continued their practices in secret, blending them with Christian symbols to survive. Others passed down their faith through whispers and hidden rituals. Even under the shadow of colonization, the heartbeat of African spirituality never fully stopped. Colonization and Christianity were never just about faith. They were about power, control, and erasing identity. And while the Bible was used to enslave, the spirit of Africa continued to fight for freedom. Demonization of African spirituality. One of the most destructive strategies of colonization was the demonization of African spirituality. The gods and Orishas, once celebrated as protectors, healers, and guides, were rebranded as evil forces. Deities that represented nature, fertility, wisdom, and justice were suddenly painted as demons that had to be cast out. This wasn't just religion. It was psychological warfare. Priests, healers, and spiritual leaders who had long been respected as keepers of wisdom were now persecuted. Instead of being seen as community guides, they were ridiculed as witch doctors. Missionaries and colonizers turned them into symbols of fear, labeling them as dangerous or deceptive. The goal was clear. If people could be convinced that their own leaders were evil, they would abandon them and submit to foreign authority. Rituals, too, were attacked. Sacred ceremonies, drumming, offerings, and dances that had once connected people to their ancestors were suddenly condemned as black magic or idolatry. What had been a bridge to the divine was twisted into a symbol of darkness. This demonization created generations of shame. Africans were taught to fear the very practices that once gave them strength. But here's the hidden truth. This labeling had nothing to do with actual spirituality. It was about control. By demonizing African gods, colonizers created a false hierarchy where Christianity was pure and African traditions were evil. This lie didn't erase the old ways, but it forced them underground. People continued to practice, but in secret, hiding their faith to survive. The demonization of African spirituality was never about saving souls. It was about breaking identity. And even though the colonizers tried to bury these traditions under fear, the spirit of Africa endured, waiting to rise again. Syncretism, survival strategy. When colonization and Christianity spread across Africa and the diaspora, many people thought the old gods had been lost forever. But the truth is, African spirituality did not simply vanish. It adapted. This adaptation is known as syncretism, a survival strategy that allowed Africans to keep their ancestral faith alive while appearing to follow the Christian religion forced upon them. Missionaries demanded that African people abandon their gods and worship the saints of the Bible. But instead of surrendering completely, Africans found a clever way to resist. They hid their deities behind the faces of Christian saints. This was not a simple blending of faiths. It was a secret language, a spiritual disguise, and a form of cultural survival. Take Ogun, the Orisha of iron, war, and strength. To the outside world, he became Saint George, the Christian saint often shown holding a sword and slaying a dragon. But to those who knew the hidden meaning, every prayer to Saint George was still a prayer to Ogun. Or consider Yemoja, the mother of waters, goddess of the sea, fertility, and protection. She was disguised as Our Lady, the Virgin Mary. When Africans lit candles before the image of Mary, they were, in truth, calling on Yemoja, asking her to bless their children and protect their families. Then there was Shango, the fiery Orisha of thunder, justice, and dance. To the colonizers, he was transformed into Saint Jerome, a stern and powerful Christian saint. But for the people, Saint Jerome was only a mask. Behind that mask, Shango continued to receive offerings, songs, and devotion. This spiritual code allowed Africans to survive. They could honor their gods without drawing punishment from priests, missionaries, or slave owners. It was an act of resistance, a way of saying, "You can take away our temples, you can burn our sacred objects, but you cannot erase our faith." Syncretism was not only about hiding, it was about resilience. It allowed entire communities to keep their connection to ancestors, nature, and divine power, even while living under oppression. Through this system, the Orishas and other deities crossed oceans, survived plantations, and lived on in the Caribbean, Brazil, Cuba, and beyond. Even today, we see the fruits of this survival strategy in religions like Santeria in Cuba, Candomblé in Brazil, and Vodun in Haiti. What looks, on the surface, like Catholic rituals is, in reality, spiritual resistance and reawakening. Even in the darkest times of colonization, when African gods were demonized and erased from official history, they never truly vanished. Suppression may have silenced them in public, but in private, their presence remained alive. Through whispered prayers, coded songs, hidden dances, and secret rituals, the memory of the gods survived. Families passed them down orally, ensuring that even if their names were forbidden in books, they would echo in hearts and traditions. Drums carried their voices. Festivals disguised as Christian holidays became living archives of ancestral faith. In places like Brazil, Cuba, and Haiti, African spirituality took root in new forms: Candomblé, Santeria, Vodun, each one a testimony to resilience. What the colonizers tried to bury, the people carried in rhythm, movement, and memory. And now, something powerful is happening. Across the African diaspora there is a revival, a spiritual reawakening. Younger generations are reclaiming what was once hidden. They are calling the Orishas and ancestral deities by their original names, no longer in disguise but in pride. Social media platforms like Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube are filled with voices rediscovering their roots, teaching others, and celebrating rituals once shamed as pagan. This reawakening is not just about religion. It is about healing. It is about reclaiming identity, filling the spiritual void left by centuries of silence, and transforming shame into pride. Where once people were told their gods were demons, today they say, "My spirituality is not evil. It is my inheritance." The gods never left. They were always here, waiting in the drum beats, in the chants, in the memory of ancestors. Now, they rise again, called not in whispers, but in strength. Never left, the story of the Orishas is not one of disappearance, it is one of presence. These divine forces were never destroyed, never erased. They remained alive in the very elements of nature, in the waters, the forests, and the mountains. To this day, the Orishas live where they always have, within the natural world that surrounds us. When waves crash against the shore, you can feel Yemoja, the mother of the seas. When thunder shakes the sky, Shango, the fiery Orisha of justice, speaks. When iron is forged, Ogun, the warrior and master of metal, is present. Unlike many gods locked away in temples or books, the Orishas never required walls. They have always been accessible in the wind, the fire, the earth, and the rivers. But during colonization, this natural connection became dangerous. Missionaries declared African gods to be pagan, demonic, and false. To openly call on Yemoja, Shango, or Ogun was to risk punishment or death. And so, African communities used brilliance and resilience to preserve their faith. They hid their gods behind the faces of saints. Through syncretism, the Orishas found masks. Yemoja became Our Lady of Regla, Shango was linked to Saint Jerome, Ogun merged with Saint George. To colonizers it looked like conversion, a willing embrace of Christianity. But in reality, it was survival. Every prayer to a saint carried a secret meaning. Every candle lit on an altar was a whisper to the gods of Africa. This resistance allowed the Orishas to survive slavery, diaspora, and centuries of oppression. They crossed oceans, lived in silence, and continued to guide their people in disguise. Today, however, the disguise is no longer needed. Across the world, people are reclaiming the Orishas by their true names, celebrating them openly with pride. In Brazil's Candomblé, in Cuba's Santeria, in Nigeria, and even across Europe and the United States, the Orishas are honored through festivals, drumming, ritual, and song. The truth is undeniable. The Orishas never left. They are eternal. They are still here, alive in the water, alive in the forests, alive in the storms, alive in the people who remember. The Orishas did not disappear. They simply waited, wearing new faces, until the time came to be called by their real names again. Syncretism is one of the most fascinating yet painful chapters in the survival of African spirituality. At first glance, it looks like a beautiful blending of cultures, African gods living side by side with Christian saints. But when you look deeper, you see that it was never just harmony. It was a survival strategy born from violence, oppression, and fear. When colonizers and missionaries arrived, they declared African gods to be demons. Worship of the Orishas and ancestral spirits was banned, and punishments for practicing traditional rituals were often harsh. To keep their gods alive, African communities found a way to hide them in plain sight. They masked their deities as Christian saints. Ogun, the fierce warrior and master of iron, was hidden behind Saint George. Yemoja, the nurturing mother of the seas, was linked with Our Lady. Shango, the thunder and justice bringer, was disguised as Saint Jerome. To outsiders, it looked like conversion. It appeared that Africans were abandoning their gods in favor of Christianity. But in reality, every prayer to a saint carried a hidden message. Every candle, every offering, every drumbeat was secretly dedicated to the gods of Africa. This was syncretism, faith in disguise, a sacred form of resistance. It kept traditions alive when open practice meant death. It was clever, powerful, and necessary. Without it, much of African spirituality might have been lost forever. But we must also be honest. Syncretism was not simply a choice. It was forced by colonial violence. It was the result of centuries of being told that your gods were evil, that your ancestors were wrong, and that your culture was less than human. Syncretism shows both the beauty of resilience and the scars of oppression. Today, we live in a different moment. The masks are no longer needed. Around the world, people are reclaiming their ancestral gods by their real names, without disguise, without fear, and without guilt. Yemoja is Yemoja. Shango is Shango. Ogun is Ogun. Syncretism was survival. But the future is about revival, calling the gods as they are, celebrating them openly, and honoring the strength of those who kept them alive through centuries of silence. The time of hiding is over. The time of truth has returned. The disappearance of African gods did not happen overnight. It was not an accident. It was systematic, deliberate, and carefully executed. Colonizers understood that to control a people, you must first cut them off from their spiritual roots. And so began the slow erasure of African deities, step by step. The first step was to remove their names. Names carry memory, power, and identity. To speak the name of a god is to keep it alive. By silencing those names, colonizers attempted to erase them from daily life. Generations grew up without hearing the names of the Orishas or other local deities, and silence began to replace remembrance. The second step was to ban the rituals. Music, dance, drumming, and offerings were not just ceremonies. They were acts of connection. They were living bridges between the people and their gods. By outlawing these practices, colonizers tried to sever that sacred link. Temples were destroyed, sacred groves cut down, and practitioners punished for keeping traditions alive. The third step was to destroy the myths and stories. Oral traditions carried centuries of wisdom, tales of creation, justice, morality, and the divine. But these stories were branded as superstition and pagan lies. In their place, colonizers pushed biblical narratives as the only true history, replacing a rich spiritual library with a single book. And finally, the erasure was institutionalized in education. Schools taught Greek gods like Zeus and Athena. They taught Norse gods like Odin and Thor. But African gods? They were erased from textbooks, lectures, and classrooms. Children learned about everyone's gods, except their own. This silence created a void, a spiritual amnesia that still affects millions today. Yet despite this systematic erasure, the gods were not fully lost. They lived in whispers, in secret rituals, in hidden songs, and in the hearts of those who remembered. The colonizers tried to delete them, but memory is resilient. Today, people are beginning to reclaim what was stolen. By speaking their names again, by reviving their myths, and by teaching their stories, the step-by-step erasure is being undone. The African gods are returning, not as ghosts of the past, but as living forces for the present and future. The violence of colonization was not only physical, it was spiritual. Colonizers knew that to control the body, they first had to break the soul. And so, silence was deliberately created to cut African children off from their own spirituality. Imagine being raised in a world where your ancestors' gods are never mentioned. Their names are erased from your books, their stories stripped from your schools, their songs forbidden in your villages. Instead, you are told that your heritage is evil, that your rituals are witchcraft, that your ancestors were misguided. This silence was not an accident. It was a strategy. The goal was to create generations who would grow up without a link to their gods, without a connection to the spiritual power of their ancestors. And for many, it worked. Across Africa and the diaspora, children learned about Greek gods like Zeus, Roman gods like Jupiter, even Norse gods like Odin. But their own gods, the Orishas, the spirits of their land and blood, were erased. The result was devastating. Communities felt a spiritual emptiness, a disconnection from their roots. People carried shame and fear about their own traditions. This was more than colonization of land. It was colonization of the soul. Many describe it as living with an amputated soul, a deep inner, books in history. But during colonization, it was also turned into a weapon. Missionaries and colonizers did not simply preach its words. They distorted them to serve their own power. Verses were cherry-picked and twisted to justify slavery and oppression. A prime example is the phrase, "Servants, obey your masters." This was not used as spiritual advice, but as a direct command to keep enslaved Africans obedient and submissive. The Bible was presented as the ultimate truth, a book that erased centuries of African wisdom and replaced it with foreign doctrines. Colonizers pushed the idea of monotheism, the one true God. This concept became a tool to declare all African gods false, pagan, or demonic. The Orishas, Ancestral spirits and deities who had guided people for generations were suddenly rebranded as evil. By narrowing divinity to a single image of God, colonizers denied entire civilizations their spiritual diversity and richness. At the same time, Christian morality was imposed, often in direct conflict with African ethics. African spirituality emphasized harmony with nature, honoring ancestors, and community balance. But colonial Christianity preached guilt, fear, and sin. Traditions like dance, drumming, or ritual offerings were condemned as idolatry or witchcraft. Slowly, people began to associate their own gods with shame. This was not just about religion. It was about psychological control. By convincing Africans that their spirituality was wrong, colonizers planted seeds of fear and self-hatred. A person who doubts their gods also begins to doubt themselves. Entire generations grew up carrying guilt for practicing the very traditions that had once given them strength. The Bible could have been a source of spiritual growth, but instead, it was weaponized. Its selective use became a colonial script of domination, one that silenced ancestral voices while demanding blind obedience to foreign authority. The result was a wounded soul, a people disconnected from their gods, living under imposed fear, and told that salvation could only come through rejecting their own heritage. But even in the shadows, the truth remained. The gods were never gone. They were waiting to be remembered, beyond guilt, beyond shame, beyond the distortion of power. Awakening and spiritual renaissance. For centuries, African gods were silenced, erased from history books, and demonized by colonial narratives. But today, something powerful is happening. A spiritual awakening. Across the world, Afro-descendant youth are reclaiming their ancestry and proudly celebrating the gods of their ancestors. This movement is not hidden in shadows. It's happening in the spotlight of Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. Young people are using their voices and creativity to reconnect with the Orishas, deities who were once forced underground. Through videos, art, and digital storytelling, they are declaring boldly, "My religion is not a sin, my spirituality is rooted." What was once condemned as witchcraft or idolatry is now being embraced as heritage, identity, and pride. This renaissance is more than just a trend. It is a reclamation of memory. Musicians are reviving drum rhythms that once carried sacred meaning. Artists are painting Orishas in vibrant colors that shine on city walls and canvases worldwide. Designers are bringing ancestral symbols into modern fashion. Writers and poets are honoring African gods through literature that speaks to both history and the present. For the youth, this revival is not about copying the past. It's about reimagining it in the modern world. They are blending tradition with creativity, merging the sacred with the digital age. When a song about Shango goes viral, or when an image of Yemoja circulates on social media, it is not just art. It is a declaration of survival, resilience, and beauty. This spiritual renaissance also challenges centuries of shame and guilt. Colonial narratives told generations that their gods were demons. Now, the same gods are sources of strength, healing, and joy. By embracing them openly, young people are saying, "We are still here. We carry the wisdom of our ancestors with pride." The awakening is global. From Brazil to Nigeria, from the Caribbean to the United States, communities are reconnecting with ancestral practices. Festivals, ceremonies, and online communities are weaving together a network of remembrance. In this renaissance, the Orishas are no longer hidden behind saints. They stand revealed, honored, and loved. And in every drumbeat, in every painted mural, in every viral post, the message is clear. The gods never left. They were waiting for us to return. From shame to pride. For generations, African spirituality was forced into hiding. What was once sacred was labeled as dangerous, evil, or demonic. Families were told to feel shame for honoring their ancestors, and entire communities carried the weight of guilt for practicing the traditions that once gave them life. But today, a transformation is happening. The silence is breaking, and pride is returning. One of the most powerful examples of this shift can be seen in the rituals of everyday life. On Fridays, people proudly wear white, an ancient tradition of purity and respect. Candles are lit for Exu, the messenger of the Orishas, not in secret, but openly, with joy and reverence. Candomblé and Umbanda, once practiced in the shadows to avoid persecution, are now celebrated in public festivals, ceremonies, and community gatherings. These practices are no longer whispered. They are sung, danced, and lived with pride. This is more than religion. It is liberation. Where once faith was used as a prison, today spirituality has become a doorway to freedom. No longer chained by guilt or fear, Afro-descendant people are reconnecting with their gods, their ancestors, and their own sense of dignity. Spirituality now stands as a source of joy, music, rhythm, and art. It is a celebration of being alive, of knowing that the divine exists, not only in books or churches but also in the sea, the forest, the drumbeat, and the human spirit. By moving from shame to pride, people are reclaiming their roots and declaring, "Our spirituality is not a curse. It is our strength, our freedom, and our connection to those who came before us." Collective resistance. Rediscovering African gods has never been just about faith. It is about survival, memory, and power. For many Afro-descendant communities, turning back to their ancestral deities is both a personal healing journey and a political statement. To honor the gods once demonized is to declare, "We are still here." Colonization tried to erase these gods, rewriting history to convince generations that they were lost or destroyed. But every ritual, every drumbeat, every whispered prayer kept them alive. Today, their revival carries a message of resistance. It says, "Our spirituality is not inferior, our gods are not false, and our heritage is not something to be ashamed of." This act of remembering is also an act of rebellion. By rejecting the imposed narratives of colonial religion, people are reclaiming dignity stolen from them centuries ago. Lighting a candle for Exu, dancing for Shango, or invoking Yamoja is more than worship. It is defiance against systems that once demanded silence. Collective resistance also strengthens identity. When a community gathers to celebrate their gods, they are building unity and resilience. They are saying, "We will not be defined by the chains of colonization, but by the power of our ancestors." This is why festivals, ceremonies, and digital movements are so important. They create spaces where African spirituality is not just preserved, but celebrated. The rediscovery of African gods is not nostalgia. It is a living movement. It is about honoring those who came before while giving strength to those alive today. In every ritual, the message echoes loud and clear. We are still here, unbroken, and proud. Healing through remembering. For centuries, the forced silence around African spirituality left deep wounds. Communities were cut off from their gods, rituals, and ancestral wisdom. This deliberate erasure created generational trauma, a spiritual void that lingered across families and societies. Children grew up disconnected from the traditions that had once guided their ancestors, unaware of the strength, knowledge, and identity that had been deliberately hidden from them. Yet, healing begins with remembering. Rediscovering the gods is more than a spiritual revival. It is a reclamation of identity. When people honor Orishas, Yamoja, Shango, and other deities, they reconnect with the stories, wisdom, and rituals that give meaning to life. Every drumbeat, dance, prayer, and festival becomes a bridge linking the present to the past. This process is not just cultural, it is deeply personal. Healing through remembering restores pride and self-worth, filling the void that colonization once imposed. Individuals begin to recognize that their spirituality is not shameful. It is powerful, rooted, and alive. The gods, once silenced, now speak again through music, art, rituals, and storytelling. The power of remembrance is captured in the words, "I didn't come from the void. I came from a people who knew." Every ceremony, every story told, every tradition revived is a declaration that African spirituality was never lost. It was merely waiting to be remembered. Healing through remembering allows people to reclaim their souls and embrace their ancestors' wisdom. It is a movement of resilience, pride, and joy. By reconnecting with what was suppressed for so long, Afro-descendant communities not only restore their spiritual heritage, but also cultivate a profound sense of identity, strength, and belonging.